All right, welcome everybody to our NACBS book event on By the Numbers, Numeracy, Religion, and the Quantitative Transformation of Early Modern England by Jessica Otis. Today, Jessica will be joined by Ted McCormick to discuss her book. And I'm just going to begin by briefly introducing our speakers. I'll turn it over to Jessica, who will speak very briefly about the work, and Ted will make a short comment, and then we'll have a lot of time today for a nice Q&A. So Jessica Marie Otis is Assistant Professor of History and Director of Public Projects at the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media. Her research explores how people adopt and adapt to new information technologies, as well as the ways those technologies can transform previous understandings of both the natural world and human history. So her recent and current digital history projects include World History Commons, an OER for teaching world history, Data Scribe, an Omeka S module for transcribing structured data, Mathematical Humanists, a workshop series teaching mathematical concepts that underpin common DH methods, and Death by Numbers, examining the early modern London bills of mortality. So her book, By the Numbers, is now available through OUP, and that's what we'll be discussing today. And she'll be joined by Ted McCormick, who is Professor of History and a Fellow in the School of Irish Studies at Concordia University in Montreal. He is the author of William Petty and the Ambitions of Political Arithmetic and Human Empire, Mobility, and Demographic Thought in the British Atlantic World, 1500 to 1800, each of which have won the John Ben Snow Prize from the NACBS. All right, so with that, I will turn it over. Hope you'll join me in welcoming Jessica.
Hi, everyone. So I just wanted to give kind of a brief introduction to the book in the sense of a motivating example and a high-level summary of what the book is about, just for those of you who haven't had a chance to read the whole thing. So motivating example. A couple of weeks ago, I picked up my niece from preschool, and as we were driving home, it was about 5 o'clock. All the school buses were everywhere at that time. So we were counting school buses. And so, we counted 5 school buses and we're very excited, and then turned the corner and drove a little bit more. And I saw 3 more school buses. And I said, oh, look, there's 1, 2, 3 school buses. And my niece, she's 4, she looks at me and she says, that means we've seen 5, 6, 7, 8 school buses. And so this is a form of verbal arithmetic. And the example I've now just given you has talked about numeracy in several different ways, right? There's been a very imprecise level of numeracy when I talked about time a couple of weeks ago. There's a very precise numeracy when I talked about time saying 5 o'clock. We've talked about counting. We've talked about the quantification of objects. We've talked about ways of adding. And these ways of adding are not the kind of advanced mathematics of people with PhDs in math. This is just kind of the ordinary everyday mathematics that my niece picked up almost spontaneously. I certainly did not teach her counting on arithmetic. And so this is kind of a level of numeracy in culture that I was really interested in exploring in my book. The kind of level of numeracy that's practiced every day by ordinary people, not all 4-year-olds. In fact, evidence about small children's mathematics is very hard to come by. It's few and far between, but I've managed to eke out a few examples in the book. So the overall argument of the book is that there was a quantitative transformation during the early modern period. This sort of everyday numeracy changed significantly between, say, 1500 and 1750. And it was a threefold transformation. It's a transformation in the syntax used for numbers. So this is the famous rise of Arabic numerals. It was also a transformation in the way people learned mathematics, an educational transformation that really made mathematical education significantly more book-based than it used to be. And then most importantly, I think for most of us as historians, it was a transformation in the way people use numbers to understand the world, their daily lives. And the example of that I continue on in my postbook project, Death by Numbers, is looking at mortality statistics and the quantification of death during London plague epidemics. So that's kind of the big picture, what the book is about. And I'm happy to dive into the details wherever people have questions. But I don't want to talk too much until Ted has had a chance to talk and you've had a chance to ask questions.
Okay, I have a brief comment. I wanted to preserve some time for questions, but maybe I'll throw some of mine in later on. So By the Numbers is a book not about numeracy, but about plural numeracies understood as technologies of knowledge. These could be performative, oral or finger counting. They could be object-based, using counters or tally sticks. They could be written using English words or Roman or Arabic numerals. While they were sometimes in competition, they also required different skills, and they served different, though overlapping, sets of functions. They thus coexisted and interacted over long periods of time, especially in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. This is one of those points that seems intuitive when made, but takes work and imagination to make well, and is easily forgotten in breathless accounts of intellectual or technological revolution. One upshot of the book, as you've just heard, I think, is a reassessment of the significance of the shift to Arabic numerals, which accelerated in the latter part of the period, in terms of these skills and functions. First, Arabic numerals united in one numeracy, both the function of permanent recording that Roman numerals had long played, and the function of calculation that had previously been a matter of performative or object-based technologies. Second, the widespread adoption of Arabic numerals as both a recording and a calculating tool linked numeracy with literacy in new ways. As this implies, the history of numeracies that By the Numbers tells is a complex social and cultural story in which various functions we associate with numbers are linked or sundered from one another in different ways at different times, depending not only on the technical characteristics of a given form of numeracy, but also, and very interestingly, on its relationship to norms of trust, transparency, convenience, and permanence, as well as on the social infrastructure available for inculcating the skills needed to use it, matters of apprenticeship, school curricula, and print culture. By the Numbers traces this history in all these dimensions, and it's a very impressive piece of work in so doing. It follows, too, the cultural ramifications of new numeracies and their material forms. These ramifications include a new appreciation of the relativity of time, revealed by the proliferation of calendars and almanacs, a reorientation of subjective experience to clock and calendar time, but also to numerical measures, if not yet mathematical calculations, of the scale and the probability of events. And finally, increasing recourse to argument through numbers, fed by data gathered in parish registers, bills of mortality, censuses of the poor, and tax assessments. These shifts involved material changes, but also renegotiations of worldview, as when early probabilistic thinking came into conflict with providentialism, subject of a very nice chapter. This is a very rich, yet also very concise history in terms of its substance. It also carries some methodological implications for those of us interested in the history of quantification, quantitative modes of argument, or stereotypically quantitative entities, such as population. One is that the rise of numeracy, or rather the reorganization of numeracies, in the early modern period was a social, material, and media process rather than simply a technical, intellectual, or disciplinary leap forward. Another is that the long-term ramifications, to say nothing of the apparently logical implications of a technology, may be of little relevance in understanding its historical uptake. As other reviewers have already observed, this promises to be a path-breaking book.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ted. So at this point, thank you to Jessica and Ted. We would like to open it up for discussion or questions for Jessica about the work. Ted, I don't know if you want to get started with one of yours, or if anyone wants to drop one in the chat, or for the discussion, you can also just raise your Zoom hand, the little Zoom button, and we will go ahead and take questions as they come in. All right, so I will go ahead and read the chat questions out loud also for the recording. So, hi Jessica, excited to read the book, just got a copy. Can you tell us a little bit more about your sources and research methods?
Yeah, so I would say that I'm going to answer the research methods questions first, which is to say, I like to joke that my main methodology is the magpie methodology. If someone else is doing something that looks interesting, I steal their method and I use it. I consider myself pretty, the closest I think that I would sort of map to traditional methodologies that of a cultural historian. That's sort of where I envision myself as starting, but I definitely have strayed very far from that at various points in the book. Certainly some of the early sections where I spend a lot of time reading like neuroscience and things like that, are not typical parts of the historian's methods. And I used a lot of sort of modern child psychology educational research to really pin down what's happening at the linguistic and the initial acquisition of numeracy levels of a child's education, and use those as models for what to look for in my historical sources. Once I sort of had some of these concepts, these modern educational concepts, it was really easy to see that 400 years ago we were doing similar things. So I sort of, like I said, my method is kind of that of a magpie. In terms of sources, I started off reading a lot of arithmetic textbooks, account books, and then I just sort of followed the numbers. Wherever there were numbers, I looked more. So researching, for example, the bills of mortality, as soon as I found my first reference in a parish register to mortality statistics that separated out plague and other mortality, I started diving down that rabbit hole. I've done a lot of research into kind of like family papers and things like that. And really, once you start looking for numbers, they're kind of everywhere. So the biggest challenge has actually been dialing it back and saying, okay, I'm not going to look at this now because the book needs to end at some point, right? It needs to be finite in scope. But it's kind of amazing once you really start looking for them. The numbers are everywhere, and you can see people doing really interesting things with them over the course of the early modern period.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, I'm wondering also, you mentioned that the mortality papers were a post-book follow-up. Is there a reason that you decided to go towards the digital history on that? You know, in what ways did that come out of this?
Yeah, so the bills of mortality immediately caught my imagination when I first ran into them. So for those of you who are less familiar with the bills of mortality, starting in the, we'll say 17th century, but like it's more complicated than that. But starting in the 17th century, they start printing weekly mortality reports for the City of London, and they're quantified. They're quantified reports, which is very different from the way other people had been tracking mortality. And so the first thing I wanted to do was to get all of them, and transcribe them and see what was in them, and start running mathematical analyses on them. So I started doing that work, oh gosh, probably like 2014, 15 was really when I really started working on those more in depth. And that was the same time I started really getting into digital humanities. And it became obvious to me, one, that this was something that was of great interest to people, that people wanted to know more about the bills. So a digital humanities project made sense, and that this was a public facing project. It's also a project, the data set, once it's finished transcribing, it's really amenable to like network analysis and GIS work and things like that. So it will probably also be a book at some point too, but for now it's a DH project.
All right, thank you. Okay, our next question is, what was the significance of the change from rolls to books, if any, not just double entry bookkeeping, but also psychologically?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not entirely certain I can answer it, in that most of the sources I've seen were already in books. I know a lot of the government records were still in rolls at that time, but most of the things that I've encountered were already in book form. I'm sure there was a change. The rolls that I use, they are very different technologies of knowledge. Certainly, there's nothing that would stop you from using a roll the same way you use a book in terms of recording mathematical and quantitative information. So that's an interesting question, but I think I'm gonna mostly have to punt on it. I apologize.
All right, if you have any other questions, you can also just raise your Zoom hand if you'd rather ask.
I'm gonna exercise my privilege here to ask.
Please, go ahead.
So, I mean, I've talked a little bit about how sort of empirically rich and complicated the history is that you trace here. And in the epilogue, you note that the role of early modern numerical practices is often invoked in big arguments about, to quote your epilogue, globe-spanning phenomena such as capitalism or modernity. And I mean, it seems to me on the one hand that attention to the material history of these numeracies and the contingency of their particular historical configurations would tend to localize this history. Although on the other hand, you do, in certain cases, it creeps in, I think, in relation to census taking. Certain numerical practices are, or really take hold in colonial spaces before they become, at least before they become national concerns in the metropole. So I guess I'm just curious in general about how an approach that really centers the specific material practices involved in different kinds of numeracy, what that does for, or whether that can do things for longer term, bigger histories of these things where quantification just tends to be invoked as a monolith.
Yeah. So I've talked to quite a few people who like to make the big picture arguments. I was actually telling Ted, I was talking to a macroeconomist yesterday. I was very excited about the potential of my book to support his arguments about the rise of modernity. Like, great, you make those arguments. But I feel like the sort of locality and the specificity of this historical argument can help some of those bigger picture arguments, in that they've been looking at this at, I talk about like the trees for the forest view, right? They've been looking at the big forest, and I've gone down and I've wandered amongst the trees and I've seen how the forest is working as an ecosystem, which doesn't mean you can't look at the forest as a big picture object. But now if you choose to do so, you can look at the forest as a big picture object with a better understanding of how it functions as an ecosystem. I think one of the things that I would love to see going forward, kind of for the field, is for more people to do these kinds of studies about other localities, right? I've looked at England because that's the place that I'm most familiar and interested in, and obviously looking at, you know, the British colonies and so forth. But looking at how these sort of numerical practices in the Holy Roman Empire or in Spain and the Spanish colonies, how they differ, how they're similar. I think studies like that would be really useful to also kind of provide a framework that would underlie these big picture arguments about modernity. Seeing what's similar, what's different, and how they change when they go overseas to the Americas, and to other parts of the globe. Because I do think that one of the really interesting things about this moment in time for English history is the culture that we're looking at will eventually be kind of the basis for a globe-spanning empire that's exporting its culture all over the world, exporting its forms of numeracy and so forth. And so there's bigger picture arguments you can make that are rooted in this moment in time and space. But I also think it's really important to root it in this moment in time and space to see what's actually going on, and not not just what it looks like from the perspective of, you know, like a very dim glass, you know, 400 years later, like actually getting in on the ground and seeing how it works.
Great. I'll go ahead and read another. We got a follow-up question. I suppose one obvious question is how this relates to the always in evolution stat formation. Forgive such a naive question. It's a Weberian question, I guess. Sorry, my box is a little cut off there.
Yeah, state formation. Yes. I definitely read a lot of the historiography and state formation for some of the latter chapters, and thinking about how the information state, if we can call it that, functioned in the early modern period, and how quantification became part of the way that the various states, I think, both local governments and religious governments, and of course national governments, use numbers and other ways to gather information and then to make decisions about matters of governance. So I definitely think that various government entities were using numbers in kind of the same way that I'm talking about more generally in this book, right? And this gets to, when I talk to people, sometimes I call it like popular mathematics or like non-elite mathematics, right? It's not that Isaac Newton wasn't involved in like the Mint, right? But there are very few Isaac Newton level mathematicians who are part of governments. Most of the people who are doing this kind of work are more like the infamous Samuel Pepys, who was taking his arithmetic and lessons, right, when he was working for the Navy. And so kind of looking at this sort of more baseline level of mathematics makes it possible to see what these government actors would have had available to them as sort of their cultural repertoire with respect to numbers and thinking quantitatively.
Excellent, thank you. All right, I will go ahead and read this. Can you talk a little about the material culture of numeracy? What were the kinds of print and material objects people used to learn numeracy, and how long did they last in people's numerate lives?
Yeah, so there's multiple kinds of numeracy during this time period that Ted kind of laid out. So some of the types of numeracy are performative, which is to say like oral numeration, like what I described with my niece and my with school buses. There's also like numeration on your fingers, right? Counting with your fingers. Finger counting is a very common form of numeration. And so obviously like these are material objects, shall we say. My hands are objects that are attached to me. I always have them. They will hopefully last my whole life. But you know, pending some dramatic accident where I lose a finger. And so these kinds of material objects are embodied. Once we get beyond that, when we start talking about performative objects, this is where we get into counting boards and tally sticks. And the counting boards are really fascinating because so a counting board, right, can be a board, it can be a table, it can literally be lines drawn in the sand or like chalked on an object. So they vary a lot in scope. And so the materiality of them differs based on what materials you have to hand. So it's very flexible in that way. And so some of them last longer than others, right? A table might last you a couple of years or a couple of decades, depending on how well you take care of it, how much you use it. You know, lines chalked on a table will last until you wash the table. So they can be very ephemeral. And then what you use, of course, on the counting board is some sort of token. These could be metal counters. Those are really common. They last a very long time. I often troll eBay for counters. They have lots of them. I've bought several that are in really good shape. So they can last hundreds of years. They can also wear out through overuse. And, you know, every couple of decades, you might want to replace your metal counters. But people don't have to use metal objects. They can just use like a bunch of pebbles that you pick up, right? In which case you use them as long as you want, then you throw them away when you're done with them, like back into the woods or whatever. So it can vary a lot. Once we start talking about literate forms of numeracy, that's where things can also get kind of interesting in terms of materiality. As far as I can tell, most people, when they're learning numeracy, they aren't using pen and paper as much as we would expect them to. Wax tablets seem to be kind of like the go-to school object, or like horn or other kind of things that you use to practice your writing on. That, you know, a wax tablet, you like do your stylus and then you kind of erase it, sort of like a modern chalkboard. And then people do eventually start, you know, writing on parchment and paper and things like that, that have, you know, very long lifespan, assuming you don't like burn them or whatever. So they can kind of vary in terms of how long they last. And of course, once you pick up the skill to use any of these objects, then you can acquire a new one and the skill tends to stick with you. Yes, I think. Oh, I didn't mention textbooks. They do definitely use textbooks like that. That is a whole chapter on textbooks. And they also can have a very long afterlife. They're often passed down between families, but they also, to conversely, you know, they can fall apart through overuse. So a lot of them don't survive.
All right, and then could you expand on the role of religion and numeracy?
Yeah. So it's really interesting when I started kind of researching how people talked about numbers. They really saw numbers as part of the Christian religion. They saw numbers as something that was inborn to humanity. And how can something be inborn to humanity? Well, because God decided it was going to be that way. And so you see a lot of authors writing about how God had, for example, given people 10 fingers so we can count to 10, and that how the ability to work with and use numbers is what separates humans from animals. It's what gives them dominion over animals. It's a fundamental part of the human soul. And so there's kind of a religious underpinning explanation for human abilities with numbers. Today, we would start talking about like neuroscience and MRI brain imaging and things like that for why humans can use numbers. But religion was basically the material they used to explain this. And we also see that kind of throughout the period when people are trying to use numbers to start explain the world around them, they are using numbers in conjunction with religion. So one of my favorite examples, I keep coming back to plague, is that when they're talking about quantifying plague mortality and using that to see how bad a plague epidemic is getting, or if it's abating, you'll see these numbers pop up in sermons. And so you literally have people preaching from their boxes, saying, you know, the bills of mortality have given us these numbers, which means like God's love for us is kindled and like God's on our side and like God's got your back. So let's pray extra hard because our prayers are working and the numbers are coming down. And they're citing numbers from the bills of mortality in these sermons. And so there's kind of this interconnection. The idea that God gave us numbers, we use numbers to understand God's world. And so they're very tightly connected. I could also, you know, go on with other examples, but the reason in particular that I really like what I've been able to say about religion and numeracy in this book is that in sort of modern ideas about the scientific revolution and so forth, we think of them as opposed to each other in some ways. This argument about like religion versus science, which has been argued like for and against over and over again. We don't need to go down that rabbit hole. But here's a very clear example of numeracy reinforcing religion, religion reinforcing numeracy, and the tight interconnections between them.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so another follow-up. This comes back to what Ted mentioned about providentialism in a way. In what way? Or am I missing or misinterpreting something? Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fine. So the talk about providentialism, it all comes from the chapter on chance. And I go kind of like deep into the weeds there on there about people's conception of God's providence, God's special versus God's general providence. So the special providence is the miraculous interruptions of the natural order. And then the general providence is kind of like maintaining the natural order. And so people use numbers, right? Both to argue that the numbers can help us understand God's general providence, right? We can understand the world with numbers because God set it to work. God made the world by number, weight, and measure. It's the biblical quote they use, right? So he made the world by number, weight, and measure, so we can use number to understand his general providence. But we can also then use numbers to understand his special providence when he interrupts the natural order to, for example, bring plagues or to get rid of plagues and things like that. Numbers can also be used to understand and interpret these as well. And there's some other really cool stuff in that chapter about gambling and providence. So it's well worth reading if you're interested in that.
All right. You've touched upon this a bit, but can you tell us a bit more about the actors in your book? You've mentioned children and specific state officials, but are there other key players or unexpected people who show up?
Yeah, so a lot of different groups of people wander through the book in and out at various points. There is a lot about people who are keeping accounts, especially in the early chapters when I'm tracking how people are using different kinds of using different kinds of numeracy. So people who are keeping accounts, whether it's shopkeepers or big landowners, anyone who is dealing with money in some way, shape, or form. I spend a fair amount of time talking about the exchequer too, because that's where they using the tally sticks, really fascinating stuff there. A lot of the actors in the book also are kind of like mathematical educators and students. So I talk a lot about how mathematical education comes about, the tutoring, the textbooks, the way that people pick up mathematics through apprenticeships or formal schooling. There is a lot about the, I say just sort of a lot about kind of everyday merchants and tradespeople, sort of running through the entire book at various points in time. And this is both men and women. Of course, you know, the sources say a lot more about men than women, but pretty much everything I'm talking about, there's nothing inherently only men about it, right? There are examples of women picking up mathematics, doing their own accounting, running their own account books. Occasionally, some women are learning some of these higher mathematics and doing this. Certainly, when we talk about time, for example, right? Women are not somehow atemporal, right? They understand the timing of the clock hours and the days of the month and the days of the week and everything as much as men do. So I would say, as much as I can, I really try to touch on every kind of large social group, except maybe the elite mathematicians. I've sort of left them out. People have written enough about them. But to try and get to kind of how ordinary groups of people are using numbers at various points in their lives.
Yeah, and I'm wondering actually if you could follow up a little bit about the education component. So, you know, not knowing this material well at all, but you know, you're describing an evolution here. And I'm wondering, like, what are the various push and pull factors? So, like, is it coming from it being taught differently? Like, you know, is there, you mentioned this whole like practicality aspect, right? That these are the reasons and sort of like, you know, apprenticeship model, like, so what are the, like, you know, is it that education is shifting? Like, is it the practicality changes the way it's taught? Is the teaching changing the way that it's being adopted? You know, is there a relationship there, or is it just sort of, are these things all happening at once?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a chicken and egg thing going on there. So saying which came first is a little difficult. But there is a major shift, of course, happening in this time period with the printing press and increasing literacy rates. And that those trends make it possible for text-based education to be more widely available, right? And if we talk about text-based education, if you are trying to describe how to like do numeration with Arabic numerals, it's really easy to do that in print. If you're trying to do it with a counting board, it involves like these big wood cuts and like counting board arithmetic is something that's super easy to teach face to face. I do it with my students in the classroom. You know, I show them, I move things around, they get it, it's easy. If I were to try and put that in print, I'd probably have like 50 pages of woodcuts to do what I can do in like 5 minutes in front of my students, right? Like just to try and show it. So the economics of how you produce a book mean that the text-based education lends itself so much more easily to talking about Arabic numeral numbers as numbers and for their arithmetic. So I think that they are driving some of the spread and the adoption of Arabic numeral-based arithmetic methods because, of course, you could pay a tutor or you could pick up a textbook. Which one is more expensive? Well, you know, some of the used textbooks I've seen have gone for as cheap as 6 pence. You're not going to find someone to teach you math for 6 pence. And those books then are often handed down in families. You see, especially when people write their names in them, you can see they've gone through multiple generations of a family. And some of the early textbooks, like in the 18th century, they're still being used for like the women of the family are using the 16th and 17th century textbooks. So presumably their brothers are getting like more up-to-date ones, but they've at least, you know, found a textbook that they can learn out of. And so I think that they're mutually reinforcing each other. The other thing about these sort of educational trends, and Ted mentioned the connection between numeracy and literacy in his summary of the book. They really are tightly connecting literacy and numeracy as the early modern period goes by, because to do Arabic numeral arithmetic, you really have to be literate in the sense of being able to write. So it's the technologies that you use, the wax tablets, the pen and paper, right? Like all of these things are the same technologies, the same skills that you use to write. And you'll often see writing masters who also teach arithmetic. And so these educational trends kind of get bound up in each other, and which one started it, that's why I'm calling it like a chicken and egg. They reinforce each other, probably iteratively as they continue. So there is definitely, I think, a very strong connection between them, and the education trends are a really important part of the changes that are happening in this period.
Thank you. All right, so probably an imponderable question, another one that maybe you can't answer, but why did Roman numerals persist in some contexts, like the probate inventories? Was it just convention?
Yeah, so Roman numerals are in some ways superior to Arabic numerals, and in particular in terms of their like forgery proofness, right? They're much more trustworthy. They're more distinct symbols. They are easier to put into an inventory and prevent people from modifying and changing the numbers. So if you have a series of numbers you want to put down and make sure that they are as secure and as tamper-proof as possible, Roman numerals are a better bet for you than Arabic numerals. So in some contexts, then, that might be the reason. Roman numerals also, they work really well with the counting board system. So in some places you will see Roman numeral use, and that indicates that in fact some sort of arithmetic happened with a counting board, and it's easier to transfer it to Roman numerals than it is to a different number system like Arabic numerals. So in some places it's actually evidence of an underlying calculation technique rather than a specific choice about the way you're recording it. And then also, there are some places where it persists. It's because people like them, right? Why do we talk about like King Charles III, Roman numeral, 111, as opposed to King Charles III with a 3? Just, we prefer it that way, right? It's become a social convention. There's some prestige in the way it's used. People like it, and so this is not necessarily like a strong argument for superiority or the way it works. It's just human preference.
And they said thank you. I haven't thought of that. I'll give everyone a second for other questions to come in.
I feel like Ted hasn't gotten to ask many questions.
I know, Ted, you want to jump in?
Actually, yeah, I've been sort of thinking about, well, I guess the simplest way to put this is what is it that makes England distinctive here? And I don't mean kind of precocious or ahead of the curve or anything, but one implication of looking at numerical practices this way is that they are, as we've said a couple times now, quite local in a lot of respects. So I'm interested in what is this would you find the same story happening in much the same way if you were looking instead, well, at Italy? I think we know from the book that the chronology of changes is at least different there. So, what is it that sets England apart here, either in a positive sense or in a negative sense, I guess?
Yeah, so I've definitely done the comparison to Italy and England a couple of times. And when people start asking me about what sets England apart, especially compared to what's happening in Italy, my response is usually a slightly joking, well, the English get to the game really late. And because of that, they are going through some stages in kind of the adoption of Arabic numerals and the rise of literacy and everything, 200 years after the Italians in some ways. And
Right.
so because of that, because of the historical moment that they are picking this up, there are other technologies and other things happening in the wider world that impact them. So, right, the printing press is already around when the English are doing this, as opposed to, when the Italians are doing it, they're still working in manuscripts. We are exploring the New World. We are sailing across the globe during the early modern period in a way that we weren't a couple of hundred years before. So when we talk about the relativity of time, for example, it becomes incredibly obvious to people on a ship sailing around the world the way time is based on space. But if you are not doing those kinds of huge transglobal explorations, it's not as kind of in your face. Other things that are happening, right? Calendar reform is finally happening now. And so there's sort of a like a domino effect of things that are happening at the moment when the English are finally starting to get the literacy rates and the systems in place to look at Arabic numerals and seriously consider their use as a system, that I think is really interesting and fascinating. And I can't say, again, because I haven't done any studies into, like, for example, Spanish and Portuguese numeracy, I can't say that you won't see similar trends there. In fact, I suspect you might, although Spanish numeracy, of course, would be really fascinating because, in fact, Arabic numerals come to Spain hundreds of years before everywhere else, because of their connections to the Islamic world and Arabic scholarship. And there's one moment in the book where I mentioned originally Arabic numerals are called Toledan numbers because they came from Toledo originally. So I think that the really interesting thing about England is just that it's coming so late. I also think that probably some of the state formation practices, to go back to state formation, that are happening, not to say like the Tudors and Cromwell and everything are unique in human history, but some of the processes that start under them and then continue and intensify through the 16th and 17th century are happening at the same time. And so I think the fact that these are all happening one on top of each other makes it a really complicated and interesting story. And this is sort of what makes the English experience unique compared to some of the continental experiences.
Excellent. So while folks think of other questions, if you don't mind my asking it more of a process question, I think that this is largely based on your dissertation research. Is that right? Your dissertation. Do you mind talking about how that process was of adapting this to a manuscript, and if it was straightforward, if it was a cutting back as opposed to building up more, if it, are there any things you would do differently, or maybe things you should absolutely do? Just interested in what this process was of going from the dissertation to the book.
Yeah. Well, I would say the process was I finished the dissertation, and the first thing I did was I wrote the Journal of British Studies article that is the education chapter. If you've seen that, that came out in 2017. And then I ignored it for 5 years, which was probably the best thing I could have done. Because when I was ready to come back to it, I was able to see it with fresh eyes, and I was able to see all the holes that I really hadn't been able to fill before. So some of the big changes that have happened since then, for example, like the entire introduction, where I kind of dig into neuroscience and things like that. All of that is new material. There's a lot of untangling of the issues around like trust and materiality that I came back to, and I think are dramatically improved by having just a few years distance, and also having spent a couple of years using my dissertation research to teach in the classroom. So I whenever I teach, if possible, I try and get the counting boards out there and in front of the students and tally sticks, and I make them do exercises with them. And I think this is the moment where I should drop into chat if anyone wants to see some of my pedagogical materials on that. The World History Commons project, we put together a teaching module on pre-modern math, and the sources there are actually videos of me doing counting board arithmetic. If you want to see how counting board multiplication works, it's there. But so having used these and kind of really sat with and experienced the materiality of a lot of the objects made me think a lot more about this. It's also, it was, gave me time to kind of go back into the archives and, targeted research for things that I considered to be holes, things that I wanted to find evidence of practices of, that I hypothesized had happened, but I didn't have evidence of yet. And so that was really useful for me. And then, of course, the entire process of turning it into a book, getting my peer reviews, doing my edits, getting feedback from my editor, all of that, I think, just made the book a lot better. So.
Thank you, I appreciate it. All right, and Susan also in the comments said amen to that. Coming back with fresh eyes. All right, so are there any other questions? You can also feel free to just raise your Zoom hand if you don't want to type it out. We allow chatting. It's just sometimes it's easier for the chat to manage.
if there are no more questions, I will just start riffing on random things. So
I have a question that is maybe, I don't know if this is fair in this context because it's comparing this in another book, but reading this alongside Jennifer Morgan's Reckoning with Slavery, where numeracy is also really central, but numeracy there meaning something a little bit more abstract than what you're talking about. It's kind of a sort of a two-faced thing in her book, where it's both a practical tool, a general practical tool of abstract calculation and abstraction, but it is also a norm of rationality, which becomes racialized in the 17th century, very, very importantly in her book. So I mean, these are two books where numeracy is central. It means very different things in both of them. Both of them are really 17th century books more than anything. And I think there's a sort of rise of numeracy that does important ideological work in her account. But that also, some of the ideological work it does is in denying the significance or even the presence of numerical practices in non-European, non-English, but really non-European contexts. So I guess I'm not sure that I have an extremely well-formed question, but I'm interested in what these two concepts of numeracy might have to say to each other. And I guess this kind of goes back to my first question in terms of, what would a global history of numerical practices in the early modern period look like? That's one direction that question could go. And another direction that question could go is, I mean, what do you see in your sources discussions of numeracy as a culturally specific thing, or discussions of numeracy in other places, and not just other parts of Europe, but indigenous practices, or etc.
yeah, so I found isolated examples of travelers talking about the numerical practices that they've encountered in other parts of the world. And the conversations usually tend to be sort of offhand references to how people's tallying practices, it's usually tallying, compare or don't compare to European practices. So there is kind of this sort of interest amongst people who travel, probably mostly financially based interest, right? In terms of like, I'm trading and we are both doing our math as we do our trading, and sort of observing and commenting on how other people do that. And it's actually really interesting because most of the comments are about similarity and saying how similar the ways people do math are, which isn't to say they're exactly the same, but they see similarity more than difference when they're commenting on this, which I found fascinating when I saw it. As we get later into the 17th century and kind of the early 18th century, the comments tend to become more dismissive, but dismissive in the same way that they're dismissive of the common people of their own realms, right? It's like, oh, these foreign people who just do like this old terrible math, and yeah, ordinary people here, the poor peasants, right, also are just like doing this awful, awful stuff, and like, why can't they be like me? And so it's more of a, can I call it the rise of Arabic numeral snobbery? It strikes me as that more than a specific like commentary on foreign practices, right? It's a general snobbery, as opposed to like all English calculators are doing this. I do think that the sort of quantitative mentality is also really important, right? I mostly talk about it in a relatively positive context in the book, but it has a dark side, right? And so when we talk about quantitative mentalities in terms of the slave trade, right? As soon as we start quantifying people, like really bad things can happen because we stop thinking about them as individuals. I think probably the two places in the book where I sort of touch on this, when I talk about insurance, right, I talk a little bit about life insurance and the way that has kind of some of its implications for enslaving the lives of insured people, or ensuring the lives of enslaved people, right? And sort of the implications of that, which is probably the closest that I get to what she's talking about. But also, any discussion of William Petty, and his plans for the Irish people, right? His quantitative genocide, his cultural genocide, is again, it's a quantitative argument with pretty horrifying implications when you start to think about what it actually means. And so I would say the great and terrible thing about numbers, right? You can look at things in a different way when you quantify them. You can get a different view of them, but that different view often makes it really easy to sort of discount people's humanity and to kind of think about people as just numbers. And once we get into kind of that people are just a list of numbers mindset, that can be used to justify some pretty horrific policies.
Thanks.
All right, if anyone else wants to toss any last minute questions, but I would also like to know about, going out of this, like what's next for you? What are you working on now? Is it influenced by this at all? Is it completely different? Is it, what comes next?
Yeah. So there's kind of two things that I'm working on, right? One is this Greater Bills of Mortality project. So the Death by Numbers project, which it is very much still in progress. So in some ways, I probably shouldn't share the URL, but there it is anyway. So this is the place where you can read about the work that I've been doing with students on the Bills of Mortality. So the Bills of Mortality is kind of the current big project I'm working on. And then I have sitting on my back burner a project about cryptology, specifically about 17th century family. Some of you may have heard of him, Henry Oxenden of Barham. He's most famous as a poet. He has a bunch of ciphered letters and almanacs. And so I'm really fascinated in his family's use of ciphers because he's using what we often think of as the state technology, right? You cipher things so that the people who are reading your letters and everything like that, and you're like passing state secrets, they can't find out what you're doing. The first time I encountered the Oxenden cipher, he was in the enciphered little bit was describing how they had just gone over to a neighbor's house and their son had been there. Their never to do well son had been there. And during the middle of this, they got into an argument and the son shouted that he wishes his dad was dead. That's what they encrypted, right? There's no state secrets involved in this at all. And so it's an interesting project then about how cryptography is used in a family setting, about localized politics, about the politics of the sale of their family property, rather than kind of the big nationwide politics that you would expect them to be encrypting, considering this is like during the middle of the British Civil Wars. So that's after I get done with my Bills of Mortality, my plague, that is the next one up on the docket. And both of them grow out of things that I found doing research for this book. So I'm sure that I will continue to evolve along these lines and have other offshoot projects in the future.
That's so interesting. I can't wait to see that. Ted, do you have any last questions?
No, I think I've
You're
asked my questions. Thanks.
all right, then, unless anyone has any other questions, I hope that everyone will join me in thanking Jessica and Ted and congratulating her on the work. So glad we had a chance to hear about it today.
And if you come up with any questions later, feel free to email me. I'm always happy to chat about this stuff.
Absolutely, and we will have the recording up on our website also, so folks who weren't able to attend can check it out. And all right, thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks.